Hello, this is Mr. Fordham. You're listening to the second 9 weeks poster review. So this is the review from the poster for all of second 9 weeks. So if you can't see the graphic in front of you on the video, then you might want to download the poster itself off of Google Classroom and have it up in front of yourself, and we're going to go through that together. Also, don't forget to take the little quiz after this video. Alright, so beginning at the top, let's look at the War of 1812 causes. We don't have a very clever way to remember this, but you do need to remember each of these. Okay, so the causes are impressment. That is, that the British were impressing our soldiers, as in, or our sailors, making them serve in the British Army, kidnapping them, taking our boats. As you will remember, it doesn't take much to get us involved in a war. Mess with our boats in America. That's what it takes. Trade restrictions. Our friendship with France, that also made England mad. And then guns. What about the guns? Well, we found out the British were giving guns to the Native Americans and telling them to attack us. That is a problem. Alright, the Age of Jackson. The Age of Jackson. He was our first populist president. That is, he appealed to ordinary people. And it was more about a cult of personality than it was about his particular policies and things like that. He also used the spoils system. The spoils system is you appoint your friends to political positions and awarding them with jobs and things like that. So you spoil them. That's the spoils system. Alright, the next thing you see is the causes of the Spanish-American War. We remember that with the little acronym UPAY. First of all, U is the USS Maine explodes, and the yellow journalists make that out to be like it was Spain that did it. We don't know that for a fact, but again, you mess with our boats, we get involved. P in pay. Protect American business in Cuba. We want to protect that. A, America supports Cuba. And then Y, yellow journalists call for war. Pulitzer, who the Pulitzer Prize is named after, he's one of the supporters of that, and also William Randolph Hearst, he supports it as well. They are yellow journalists. All right, moving on to discuss World War I. The good guys were the Allies or the Allied powers. That's going to remain the same for World War II if you look down. We get involved after the U.S. Gets involved, us, after the Lusitania explodes. The term that is used most often in the standard and on the milestone will probably be unrestricted submarine warfare. Okay, so they're going to use their U-boats, their subs, the bad guys, the Germans are going to use those to sink ships that have civilians on them. And it doesn't matter that we have tried to stay out of the war, but they sink this British ship. The Lusitania is a British ship, but there are over 100 Americans on board. Again, you mess with our boats, we get involved. The bad guys are the Central Powers because they are in the center of Europe. Mostly, you've got Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then you've got the Ottoman Empire, which is over where Turkey is today. They don't last very long, but they get involved as well. Looking at the first Red Scare and the Espionage Act. Espionage is another word for spying, that sort of thing. So Americans are afraid of communist terror plots following World War I. The reactions to this are the Palmer Raids and the National Origins Act of 1924. And this eventually leads to the second Red Scare and McCarthyism in the 1950s, where Senator Joseph McCarthy is pretty much accusing everyone of being a communist. That brings us to World War II. The good guys are still called the Allies or the Allied powers. These are all allies of the United States. And the United States gets involved after Pearl Harbor. Again, you want us to get involved, mess with our boats. In this case, a lot of our boats. This happens on December 7th, 1941. And FDR, in his famous speech to the nation, called this a day which will live in infamy. If you are famous, you are known for a good thing. If you are infamous, you are known for a bad thing. So that's why he uses the word infamy. The bad guys are, instead of Central Powers this time, they are known as the Axis Powers. They are Germany, which is run by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis; Italy, which is run by Benito Mussolini and his new form of leadership called fascism, which is a lot like Nazism, less racist. It's pretty much having the mob run your country, and there is private property allowed, which is different from communism. And then Japan, who is still run by their Hirohito, who is the emperor, but they also have Hideki Tojo, who is the military leader. The Soviet Union eventually switches to the good guys after Hitler stabs him in the back and invades the Soviet Union. He was on the other side, but he switches sides. Stalin believes in communism. He is the leader of the Soviet Union, and that basically communism at its very basic definition is the abolition of private property. There's no private property. Some other things you need to know: the D-Day invasion, that's the Normandy invasion, northern France, where we're going to go into France. We're going to push the Nazis out of France and back into Germany. Eventually we'll keep pushing into Germany and take Berlin, and that is called VE Day. So when Berlin falls, that's Victory in Europe Day. Then VJ Day, that is Victory in Japan Day. There's a picture hanging in my room of a sailor giving a kiss to a nurse in Times Square. That is on VJ Day. That's after Japan finally surrenders, and they surrender after the bombs are dropped. We'll talk about that in a moment. Also, a lot of propaganda was spread during this time, trying to get people to buy war bonds and victory liberty loans and things like that. Also, think about Rosie the Riveter. There's a big picture of her. She's the one against the yellow black background, that says "We can do it," showing her muscle. Got the little do-rag on her hair. She's Rosie the Riveter. She's convincing women to go out and take their husbands' jobs while they're off fighting the war. Get them involved in the war effort. Okay, and they did. And women had a big role to play in that war. Then we have the Manhattan Project, which is also part of this. This is where we developed the atomic bomb. Los Alamos, New Mexico is a place that it was tested. And then we dropped them on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And after this is done, the Japanese finally surrender, and that's VJ Day. Okay? All right, so after the war, we have the Marshall Plan. Marshall starts with an M, and money starts with an M, and that's how you need to remember this, because it was all about money. The United States gives around $12 billion to European nations for their recovery, and basically to buy their friendship after World War II and pay them to not become communist. Then let's look at the Truman Plan. President Harry Truman says, we will defend anybody that communism threatens. So we will step in and give support. And that goes on for a very, very long time. That's why we get involved in South Vietnam, because we feel that communism is threatening them, and we're worried about the domino effect of various different countries falling once other countries fall to communism. Okay? That leads us to the Cold War. It's a war of words, or a proxy war between the USA and the USSR, or Soviet Union. There's lots of different parts to the Cold War that are under that big umbrella of the Cold War. Vietnam was part of the Cold War. And when it says it's a war of words, what that means is the United States and the Soviets don't fight each other directly. We fight their people, they fight our people. That is, that we fight their friends, they fight our friends fight each other, but we don't fight each other directly, because that would have led to a nuclear war. But Vietnam is part of that. We lost many, many soldiers as a result of that. Korea is a part of that. The arms race, the space race, which brings us to Sputnik, which is the first unmanned satellite to go into space, and that comes out of the Soviet Union. Alright, so we're booming in the 20s and we're busting in the 30s. Okay, that's just a little phrase to help you remember the Roaring 20s. People were spending money and buying things on credit, and the economy was just up and running. People were partying. Think Great Gatsby. That's the Roaring Twenties. And then we're busting in the 30s. There's a bust after the stock market crash of 1929, and then on into the Great Depression. Remember that. Booming, doing well in the 20s, and busting, depressed in the 30s. All right, so the Great Depression causes, there are several of those. You need to know them. Speculation, also known as buying on margin. That is, people were borrowing money to spend it on the stock market. That's illegal today, but people were doing it. People were buying things on credit. That is, I'm buying it now and I'm going to pay you back later. That's a bad thing when you do too much of it. Bank failures, banks were falling apart. We've got something now to prevent that from happening. Something called the FDIC protects your deposits up to a very high amount. So your money is safe. It's guaranteed. It's insured in the banks today to prevent that from happening. Also, overproduction. That is, companies were making too much stuff and it was sitting in the warehouses not getting sold. They were making as if it was getting bought, and it wasn't. In fact, that's called underconsumption. That's the next word there. Overproduction and underconsumption together are a bad thing. They're making too much stuff and people aren't buying enough of it. And then the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl occurs because of the overcultivation of the dirt, the land out west. The wind comes along, it picks up that dust, that dry dust of topsoil on the top, and it brings it out east, and it makes it as far as New York City. So this is a bad problem. People aren't able to have a good crop that year during that time period. Also, know that the stock market collapsing is not a cause. That does happen in 1929. It's not a cause of the Great Depression. It's more of a symptom letting you know that it's going to happen. Think of it like when you get sick and you have a cough. Your cough is not your cold, right? Your cough is a symptom that you have a cold. So looking back at those again, you got speculation or buying on margin, credit, bank failures, overproduction and underconsumption, and the Dust Bowl. Those are your Great Depression causes. And most people blamed Herbert Hoover for that. This isn't on there, but Herbert Hoover, they called all of the various different places where poor folks would set up homes, little shanty towns. They called those Hoovervilles because they blamed him. Well, then FDR comes along and he's going to get us out of it, and he comes up with something called a New Deal. There's actually several different parts to the New Deal. He creates all these different agencies. He really expands the power of the federal government, and he has this idea of the 3 R's, okay? Relief, recovery, reform. Okay, he's going to bring relief to the people. He's going to help the economy recover, and then he's going to reform the government so that this never happens again. So that's the relief, recovery, and reform part. And he comes up with all kinds of different organizations to help with that. The CCC, the TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which brings electricity to very poor regions in the South. So he's got all those different groups and things that to help with the recovery, and there's a lot more than that. And then 1968. Remember that 1968 is the worst year ever. A lot happens that year. We've got the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Remember, JFK, his brother, had been president and was assassinated in 1963. A few years later, he's running for president, and he gets assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated that year. That's also the year of the famous Tet Offensive on the part of the Viet Cong or the Viet Minh, pardon me, the North Vietnamese Army. They attacked the South all along what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. and we lose a lot of soldiers. They attack many places in one time. That's the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. The Democratic National Convention was a disaster that year. There were riots. It was in Chicago, and Mayor Daley sends the police out there to get the protesters quiet. They're in Lincoln Park and other places, and they just can't get it together. And people watch all of this on television, and ultimately it helps to get Richard Nixon elected. Richard Nixon accomplished quite a bit. He promised to end the Vietnam War, and that's why he gets elected. He does bring an end to the Vietnam War. He opens up relations with China, and he begins a process called détente. D-E-T-E-N-T-E. It's a French word that means an easing of tensions. He does that between our communist enemies, which are Vietnam, which are China, and which are the Soviet Union. And he is the first president to visit China. There's famous pictures of him and his wife Pat on the Great Wall of China. But he eventually has to resign because of the Watergate cover-up. Now, I've underlined cover-up because he doesn't get in trouble for the Watergate break-in. He had nothing to do with that. But he does get in trouble because he tried to cover it up, folks. So do remember that. And he would have been impeached, but he wasn't. Okay, we only had 2 presidents that were impeached. They were Andrew Johnson. Back during Reconstruction, his own party tried to impeach him. But what impeachment means is to be brought on trial. It doesn't mean to be kicked out of office. He wasn't kicked out of office. We haven't had a president to get impeached and kicked out of office. But a lot of people think Nixon was impeached. He wasn't impeached. Probably would have been, but he resigned. His vice president is Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford becomes president, and he immediately pardons Nixon of any and all wrongdoing, so Nixon gets off scot-free. Other people do go to jail on account of this, though. The other president to get impeached, by the way, was President Bill Clinton, and it was because of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. He gets in trouble for trying to cover it up, basically. He is acquitted. You need to know that word, acquitted. He is cleared of the charges, Clinton is, and so he wasn't actually in trouble for it. He gets impeached but not kicked out of office, and he's in trouble for perjury. Okay, that word perjury means to lie under oath. He lied about cheating on his wife, Hillary Clinton. He doesn't get in trouble for actually cheating. He gets in trouble for lying when he's asked about it and trying to get Monica Lewinsky to lie about it. So anyhow, that was the second 9 weeks. Keep right on studying. We want that 100% pass rate. We can do it. Keep right on studying. You got this. We believe in you.